Hi folks, welcome to session 12, Stimulus Control. Up until this point, we've talked about the operant response and the consequences of the operant response, mainly the stimuli that follow behavior. And these stimuli could have either strengthening effect as a consequence in the terms of reinforcement, or it could have a weakening effect on behavior in terms of punishment. What we're going to talk about now are the conditions under which we place these contingencies of reinforcement under stimulus control. That is, what happens when you arrange the environment so that certain contingencies of reinforcement are preceded by stimuli, and on other occasions, they're not preceded by stimuli. I'm going to go ahead and freeze the camera here a second. Hang on a sec. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and get my pointer and set up my full screen, and we are set. Okay. In the world around us, we have to remember that we are constantly bombarded by stimuli that are changing all the time. That is, lights are flickering, temperatures are changing, sounds are happening, all sorts of things around us. And they really don't exert much control over behavior. That is, we don't stop and think about these things, yet these are constantly happening around us. On occasion, though, they come to actually exert control over behavior, and we do something in reference to that. If it's a noise is going on, I may not respond to it, but when I get up and all of a sudden shut the door, or I do something where a light is bothering me, or I might not respond anyway and then shut off the light, it changes from a physical stimulus, which is exerting control over no behavior, to a situation where now it exerts control over behavior. And we also have to recognize the fact that certain stimuli may affect us differently than other individuals. I work in an office with individuals who really get annoyed by, I guess it's the sound of a fluorescent light bulb or a flickering of the bulb or something, and therefore our offices are oftentimes dark. I don't respond to these things. I don't hear it. I don't see it. It doesn't bother me one bit. But to people who are sharing the desks to the left and the right of me, it really annoys them. So they keep the light off. Of course, that in turn annoys me, and I'll oftentimes go over to turn it on because I have a hard time seeing in the dark, and I'd like to have a very well lit environment. So I guess the compromise is that at one point in time, we're just going to have to go out and break down and buy ourselves some light bulbs that we could all be very, very happy with. And again, I do bring this up because there are differences in terms of the types of stimuli that do control our behavior and that we learn within our lifetime. And a lot of these have to do with how we come to use language and how we communicate with others. This is something that we're going to talk about certainly later on when we get to verbal behavior. And we're going to certainly talk about this in later classes when we get to talking about the various procedures and techniques that are out there in order to shape up effective functional communication training. Okay. All right, let's move on. We've talked about three specific functions of stimuli. In particular, we've talked about the elicitation of a response, in which a stimulus comes to elicit a response, as Pavlov and Watson talked about, and that's the situation in which the stimulus seems to pull out of the organism or draw out of the organism or elicit a response. Two other kinds of stimuli can actually serve as a consequence for behavior. One kind of stimulus follows a response and it strengthens the behavior or keeps it sustained at a fairly high level, and we talk about that as a reinforcing effect. Or another kind of stimulus that we'll spend a lot of time talking about, the punishing stimulus, which, when it follows behavior, decreases the future probability of that particular response and the strength of that response. The third kind of stimulus we're going to talk about, again, are the ones that actually precede contingencies of reinforcement. For example, we could respond under what conditions might we get reinforced for doing a behavior, but under other conditions we might get punished for doing that. We may actually learn that in the presence of mom, when I ask mom to do something, mom delivers the reinforcer. On the other hand, when I do that behavior in the presence of dad, dad tends to actually punish that behavior, and therefore I know when's a good time for asking for something, who's a good person to ask, who's not a good person to ask, and so forth and so on. We talk about these things as stimuli that set the occasion for effective responding, and we call these discriminative stimuli. And the definition of a discriminative stimulus, or what we abbreviate as SD, right, is that it's a stimulus that is present when a response is reinforced and that comes to set the occasion for that particular response. For example, I could walk over to my telephone receiver and just pick it up and say, hello, nobody's on the line. Hang up, pick it up again, hello, hang up, nobody's on the line, and do this again and again and again. But eventually, if I do this, as ridiculous as it sounds, when I do pick up the phone, somebody's going to be on the other line that says, hello. The problem here is that, again, that response could be freely emitted at any time, and it may be reinforced. But I don't do that. My behavior, as well as yours does, comes under the control of an antecedent stimulus, which is the sound of the telephone ringing. And that stimulus sets the occasion for the fact that when that phone rings, I pick up the phone and I say hello. Somebody's going to be on the other line that says hello. Okay? So in that sense, although an SD precedes behavior, just like a stimulus might precede a response in the Pavlovian sense, in this situation, the telephone ringing does not pull the response out of you to pick up the telephone receiver and say hello. It's a learned response. Okay? And it's a stimulus that just simply sets the occasion. It doesn't mean that when that stimulus rings, I'm going to go over there every single time. And we know that. If I'm watching, the fourth quarter of a football game, it's the last 2 minutes and it's tied, and I care about the outcome of that game, when that telephone rings, I'm not going to get up to answer it, even though that's a stimulus that has set the occasion for response. On the other hand, I may want to supplement that stimulus, and a lot of times what they have convenient on the television is that it actually tells you who's calling, and should I get up or should I not get up? Okay. Now, we also have another stimulus that comes to set the occasion for not responding. That is, an SD sets the occasion. If you make a response, you'll probably get reinforced. There are certain types of stimuli that are occasioned, that set the occasion for not responding. For example, an out-of-order sign. And when you see an out-of-order sign on a Coke machine, that's a stimulus that's correlated with actually extinction. Put your money in this machine, you're not going to get anything. We call that S delta. So, by the way, you see this little triangle here, you're probably wondering, why does Kupfer have a little triangle floating up here? Well, this triangle should actually be located right there. And although it's not here, I think it is on your PowerPoint presentation. So an S delta is a stimulus in the presence of which responses are never reinforced, or which is presented during extinction. S delta, you're going to come to find out shortly, is just as important as the SD when it comes to learning what's the good time to do something and when's not a good time to do something. Okay, you have to have a little bit of SD and a little bit of S delta. Okay. Now, we could talk about stimulus control, and it occurs whenever we have a situation in which an organism behaves differently in the presence of different stimuli. That is stimulus control. We say that the stimuli control the response in a different manner. And we do this all the time. We do respond differently to different stimuli. We respond differently to our children than we might respond differently to our brothers. We might respond differently to our people we work with in a professional relationship, which is a lot different than when we perhaps go out on a Saturday night and we might go partying. So behavior does come under stimulus control in the sense that we know how to behave differently in the presence of different stimuli. How does that come about? How do we come to learn what behavior should occur in this situation versus not in situations? Because if you cannot read situations very well, you're not going to probably respond effectively to the contingency of reinforcement. The origin of stimulus control happens when we have a reinforcement history in which reinforcement occurs in the presence of one stimulus and extinction occurs in the presence of a second stimulus. Okay? That is, behavior, we say, is differentially reinforced in the presence of different stimuli. All right? So we're going to go through lots of examples of this. The first example we could talk about, and by the way, this is how we talk in terms of the specification of the operant. The operant really involves three different things that we have to bring into specification. The first thing is the operant response itself. That is the environmental consequence of the response. Okay? Um, in that situation, we're talking about the reinforcer, and here we're talking about the functional effect of the response, the lever press. I press the lever, I get reinforced, and that's going to occur primarily when there is a tone in place. So we have the three-term contingency. We have the SD, the tone, the response, the lever press, and the consequent event, a food pellet. All right? So we also have an alternative. When there is no tone on, lever pressing does not produce food. Okay. Now, why is this so important? It's very important, and I'm going to show you here in a second, that just simply having a tone and presenting a tone, and occasionally it might get reinforced or not, might not get reinforced, it might not necessarily lead to what we call stimulus control. Okay. And I'm going to show you how this actually works. This is an experiment that was conducted by Jenkins and Harrison, in which they simply had rats pressing a lever. They had an SD, which was a tone that was presented at 1,000 hertz. Okay? At 1,000 hertz. So this is where the rat actually learned that reinforcement would take place in the presence of a 1,000 hertz tone. And now if we actually vary that tone across a range of tones, anything less than 1,000 hertz, anything greater than 1,000 hertz, in a situation where all we're doing is presenting tones, you see here that the rat is responding to every single one of the tones, right? Right? If they have a tone at 300 hertz, 450, 670, they respond the same across all of these different conditions. And what we could say here is that, well, the rat is not discriminating what's going on here. That is, the rat can't discriminate 1,000 from 300, from 3,500. It's basically the same across the board. And the fact is that the rat is not going to learn the difference between these. How do we go about teaching a rat the difference? In other words, if we're trying to teach an individual what's a safe environment to go to, we're going to teach them an SD that it may be in the presence of an injury or something like that. You're supposed to go to what? A hospital, or you should go to somebody who is a health expert. It may be a doctor. It may be a nurse. These are the necessary SDs that become effective to learn about when we have a situation as an injury. If we have a consumer who's actually lost in the community, we would want the consumer to learn as quickly as possible, where do you go? Do you go to a police station? You got to go somewhere to try to find help. These are the SDs that we would want them to go to. On the other hand, we wouldn't necessarily want consumers or perhaps our children going up to strangers, going up to anybody. So in this situation, if we want to teach somebody to make a discrimination under these conditions, that you should try to find help. There are certain kinds of help that are good, other kinds of help we don't want to go to, and we want to teach who's a stranger and who's not a stranger. How do we go about teaching that? Okay, so let's go back now to our original situation. Okay, if we only teach to press a lever in the presence of a tone, right, then what you're going to get is all tones become reinforced because of a generalization process. On the other hand, whenever we have a lever available and when there's no tone on, the rat presses a lever and doesn't get anything, a whole different situation arises. That is, reinforcement happens in the presence of a tone, but in the presence of no tone, reinforcement doesn't occur. And now, when we come back, and now we look at that same graph, and we now do this discrimination training of the tone is the SD that we reinforce behavior under, and when there's no tone on, there's no reinforcement. By the way, no tone happens for a rat anything less than 300 cycles or anything greater than 3,500, because this falls outside the range of typical rat hearing. Okay, and now what you got is a really nice discrimination. In the presence of a 1,000 hertz tone, that rat presses a lever. But as you get further and further away from the training stimulus, the frequency of the response goes down. In other words, the rat is under stimulus control, and we now have the discrimination of 1,000 hertz tone. And by the way, this isn't just one rat. Each one of these lines represents different subjects: rat 8, rat 52, rat 54, rat 58, rat 60, and you have 3 rats up here. All 3 of these rats did the same thing, that they did not form a discrimination. But over here, when you have 5 brand new rats and you go through this training, they all learned the discrimination. Okay? So these, by the way, are what we call generalization gradients. That's what you saw there. These are generalization gradients. This is a gradient. See, it starts at a high point, and as you get further away from the original training stimulus, the frequency, the total percentage of the responses goes down. Okay, that's a generalization gradient. So generalization happens when a response is conditioned in the presence of one stimulus. Other stimuli that are similar to that training stimulus also become conditioned. Okay, and then we generalize those particular responses. The gradient happens when we develop a gradual decline in the number of responses, or the rate of responding as a function of the distance from the training stimulus. And I have a great example for you: home stadium effect. You all should be familiar with this, okay? That is, one of the things that football teams strive for is to have the best schedule, or the best most wins in a season. Why? Because you get home field advantage. What is the advantage of home field advantage? It's your own home stadium. You have the crowd is on your side. You're familiar with the setting. You know your own turf. You know how things operate. You know that when you're in Denver, you're at Mile High Stadium, and you know how to kick the ball in a different sort of way than it's, say, if you were a kicker and you were having to kick a ball in somewhere, say, in Florida, where it's more humid and so forth and so on. In other words, this shows you the home field advantage is that when you are trained in the presence of a stimulus that you're most familiar with, you're going to have your optimal performance. Okay, and this should also make sense not only if we're talking about lever pressing in a rat under a stimulus condition, but the same thing's going to hold true when we're working with children or consumers in which we are trying to teach a particular skill. Remove the idea that we're talking about frequencies here, and instead put different staff people at each one of these spots here. Here's Bob, here's Jill, here's Blake, here's Frank, here's Travis, and so forth and so on. If this person learns a skill in the presence of this particular staff over and over again, that staff person's going to have the best stimulus control with this individual. Other individuals who are less familiar working with that individual are different stimuli along the same dimension. And you might not necessarily have as good stimulus control with those individuals. So over here you might have staff who work less frequently. Here are staff who work even less frequently. And over here, the ones who really don't exert much control over the discriminative skills of the client, or the consumer, I should say, or the child, are perhaps respite staff. These could also be substitute teachers over here, and here's your main teacher over here. We could also talk about skiing on familiar grounds. Let's say, for example, I learn on Breckenridge. So when I get to Breckenridge, I have great stimulus control. I know the slopes. I know which lifts to go on. I know whether I want to cut over to one slope or another. In other words, I'm probably going to ski best on a mountain that I learned to ski on. But as I move further and further away from that training stimulus, behavior may start breaking down a little bit. Okay, not too much. I wouldn't necessarily have a very steep generalization gradient. It may look something more like this, because usually slopes are pretty familiar, right? You're pretty familiar skiing on this. But when you start skiing on slopes that you're not familiar with, for example, you start skiing on the slopes in the Northeast where you don't have really, they call it Grand out in Vermont, which is a fancy way of saying that we're going to ski on a big ice cube. So people who learn to ski in Colorado could ski on powder. You start getting on ice, your performance is as well. Now, I'm probably beating a dead horse here, but it makes the point that stimulus generalization gradients account for an easy way to look at behavior that comes under stimulus control and then falls away from stimulus control. And we've come to study how these behaviors come about and various kinds of byproducts of stimulus control. There are really good ways to teach stimulus control, or what we call discrimination training, and there are really rotten ways to do that. And that's what we're going to be talking about over the next couple of sessions, because you're going to see that a lot of the best meant training methods that are used in our classrooms, in our day programs, in a variety of settings, really fall apart because they did not take in consideration some of the issues that we're going to talk about over the next couple of sessions. Okay? So, we could say then that generalization is actually inversely related to the specificity of stimulus control. That is, this is pure generalization. That is, the responding is generalizing across all of the tones. It doesn't matter whether it's that tone, that tone, that tone. This is happening across all of the tones. Okay? On the other hand, this shows you less generalization and tighter stimulus control. This is just the opposite of that. This is generalization, stimulus control. Okay? And as we come to learn things, we go from a situation like this to a situation like that. When I first start learning to drink wine, I might actually just respond to all wine the same, but I start making the first simple discrimination, red wine versus white wine, and I can start looking at that, but I might not make many discriminations beyond that. That's red, that's white, but I might not be able to tell the difference between a Chardonnay and perhaps a Riesling. Even though both look the same by appearance, they taste different, but over time I will come to understand that one tastes a little drier than another. So over time, as I come to learn and get reinforced in the presence, when somebody says, try this, taste this, what does this taste like to you? It tastes dry. Very good, Dr. Kupfer. What do we call dry white wines? Oh, they're called Chardonnays. Excellent. So that behavior starts getting reinforced, and when that glass gets filled again, I'm getting pretty good at tasting wines, right? If it comes along and I try to drink it and they say, this wine tastes sweet to me. What type of wine is that, Dr. Kupfer? And I say a Chardonnay. They say, no, that's not a Chardonnay. Chardonnays are dry. Sweet wines tend to be Rieslings. You know the difference? Riesling sweet, Chardonnay dry. And as I go through this training of reinforcement and extinction in the presence of different stimuli, I will eventually, someday hope to be like this when I go to taste wines. I really can't tell the difference between wines very well, and so on. Okay, now the same thing also may hold true with many things that I might listen to in terms of music, in terms of classical music. For example, I may listen to all classical music a certain way and not be able to tell one thing from another. You know, I might not be able to tell open circle is Mozart, closed circle is Beethoven, triangle here is Stravinsky. Even though those are very distinct musical styles, I might call it all classical. But if I take a class in music listening like I did at college, I come to find out very quickly that I can make very clear discriminations based on the type and style of music, the kinds of instruments that are used, and so forth, the structure of the music. All right? Hey, I think we're at the end of this section, aren't we? Very good. Again, this slide just kind of goes over, again, experiment 1 and 2. Experiment 1 showed you the upper graph there where was a generalization gradient. The lower graph here showed you what happens when you have stimulus control. One other thing before I close on this. We might look at this and say the pigeon is making a discrimination here, and up here the pigeon is not discriminating anything. Or I should actually say rats. We're talking about rats here. Down here the rat is discriminating 1,000 hertz. Up here the ramming it. We can't say what the rat is or is not discriminating. That would be a level of analysis that we don't have access to. What is accurate to say is that these stimuli across all of these dimensions control behavior in the same manner. That's different than saying there is no discrimination happening here. Okay? The question becomes, if we say the organism discriminates or doesn't discriminate, oftentimes we put the cause of discrimination into the rat. It'd be more accurate to say that across all these conditions, it controls the lever pressing in the same way. And we come to understand how discrimination training changes behavior, not by changing the organism per se, but by changing the training procedure so that we can get stimulus control to take place. And again, sometimes we do want this type of an effect with an individual. Sometimes we want this effect. If we're working with a consumer and they're at our day program, when we have them working with one staff, we would like that person to respond the same way across all staff, because we don't have one staff working on every single shift 24/7. Although I do know some organizations that really try to arrange that because they'd rather just arrange that staff person to be there all the time rather than actually take the time to teach all the staff the skills that they need to learn. Okay? So in some situations, we would like to have consumers respond across the board to all staff a certain way, but at other times it becomes appropriate to be able to recognize one particular staff from other staff. Okay, so we have to kind of go through stimulus control training here. All right, I am going to stop here, and we are now going to advance on to a section what I call byproducts of stimulus control. And these will be very important because as we come to talk about and doing some shaping of stimulus control and arranging contingencies of reinforcement in our behavior plans, I'm going to show you where you might not find orderly data or something which looks to you say, wow, something was really is up, something is weird is happening here. And it turns out it's actually a stimulus control problem that if you learn how to recognize it, you can anticipate these things happening, head it off at the pass, and have a really effective behavior plan which doesn't have a lot of pitfalls to it. So I'm going to stop here and catch you guys shortly. And see you soon.